Hello everyone, it's Jamarl Thomas. Welcome to the Progressive Soapbox. Guys, I did this video once before. I don't necessarily like that video because it went all over the place. And I want to be concise and specific when I do this particular video. So let me check my volume and I will start. If you guys enjoy what I'm putting down and you find yourself here often, please feel free to share, like, subscribe. And you can always support through Patreon or Super Chat. At this point, the channel has been remonetized. Julian Assange is suing the Ecuador. He's suing them because he's saying they're violating his rights. That ultimately, asylum shouldn't be contingent upon whether or not he shuts up. And that they've shut him up, and that's accounted to essentially human rights, not necessarily abuses, but solitary confinement. Let's take a look at the story. This story just came out, so the news on this is recent. But he's making the argument that they're violating his fundamental freedoms. In one part, it was, on another article, it was that they were silencing him. Julian Assange is suing the Ecuadorian government for violating his fundamental rights and freedoms, despite the fact that he is being sheltered in the country's UK embassy. Now, there's a little bit of English on this because it seems like the Independent doesn't necessarily like Assange all that much. At the very least, maybe I could be reading too much into it. The move comes several months after the Ecuador cut off communications with Mr. Assange, just days after it emerged that it set new house rules for the WikiLeaks founder, including a ban on political statements. WikiLeaks lawyer Baltasar Garzon has arrived in Ecuador to launch the case, which is set to be heard in domestic court next week. Here's the thing. When I was looking at this prior, one of the things that came up was whether or not it was legal for them to put in a special protocol to shut Julian Assange up. Because understand, they're shutting him up not for any kind of normal way of going about their affairs. They're shutting him up because he's a thorn in the shoe of the new president. Rafael Correa, the previous president, sometimes I mix up the two when I say their names, so I want to make sure I get the presidents right, brought Julian Assange in, and I make the case that he has this very strong sense of national sovereignty. If Switzerland can give asylum, we can give asylum. And we're not going to take second fiddle to anybody. He had a strong sense of sovereignty. The new president, not so much. And that president has been bending the knee to the UK and the United States pressure. Shutting him up was parcel to that, part and parcel to that. I have a hard time believing that the old president would have done that. Let's keep going. And the special protocols that they're giving him, talking about he needs to take care of his cat and clean his bathroom, are done just purely to embarrass him and tarnish the reputation of the guy. It's not done for real political reasons. Or it's done for political reasons, but those political reasons are to take a chunk out of him. WikiLeaks said Ecuador had threatened to remove the protection from Mr. Assange has had since being granted political asylum, and added that his access to the outside world has been summarily cut off. Mr. Assange fears being extradited to the United States if he leaves the embassy. That's a real fear. It's most likely that there's a warrant lurking behind, you could say, what Britain wants to do, meaning if he steps foot out, Britain is going to arrest him. There's a belief that there's a extradition warrant waiting for him. And judging by the language of people like Adam Schiff and Pompeo, he is not necessarily wrong. Ecuador refused a visit by Human Rights Watch General Counsel Dina Pokipner, who has likened Ecuador's isolation to solitary confinement. It is literally solitary confinement, and has not allowed several meetings with his lawyers. A statement said Ecuador's measures against Julian Assange have been widely condemned by human rights community. Mr. Assange's lawyer said that they were also challenging the legality of Ecuador's government's special protocol, which makes his political asylum contingent upon censoring his freedom of opinion, speech, and association. It is very possible that none of those things are prerequisites to political asylum. This idea that if you don't shut up, we will evict you, I don't necessarily know if it works that way. Whether or not it works that way or not, we're going to find out. They're challenging it. Good on Assange. The protocols also require journalists, his lawyers, and anyone else seeking to see Julian Assange to disclose private and political details, such as their social media usernames and serial numbers, and codes for their phones and tablets with Ecuador, which the protocol says the government may share with other agencies. Meaning, they're trying to create a hostile environment for Julian Assange. To keep away guests and visitors, because those people will have to or may have to share their information with foreign governments. The protocol claims the embassy may seize the property of Mr. Assange or his visitors and, without a warrant, hand it over to the UK authorities. This is clearly untenable. It's a hostile environment. That's essentially what they're trying to create. WikiLeaks said that the U.S. congressman had written an open letter to Ecuador's President Lenin Moreno saying that in order to advance crucial matters from the economic cooperation to counter narcotic assistance and possible return of the USAID's mission to Ecuador, we must first resolve a significant challenge created by your predecessor, Rafael Correa. The statement of Julian Assange. The status of Julian Assange. Pressure is mounted on Ecuador to hand over Assange to the UK, WikiLeaks believes. What do you mean WikiLeaks believes? You've just read U.S. congressman had written an open letter to Ecuador's president, Lenin Moreno, saying that in order to advance crucial matters, yes, he's being pressured. Ecuador is being pressured. Yes, yes. It's not just they're saying, it is true. It is understood that the theme of the legal action will be on Mr. Assange's isolation, the ban on the visits, speech restrictions, and the failure to live up to the international obligations. Essentially, regardless of whether or not your government is now hostile to Mr. Assange, the previous government has allowed Assange to stay into the country, and there should be a continuity of asylum, meaning you can't just, with the new government, say we no longer like this, and our international treaty obligations or our obligations for asylum can just be rescinded in a whim. Not so much. You have to live up to your obligations. I agree. Good on Julian Assange. Good on WikiLeaks. So I'll end this here because the other one went all over the place and I want this one to be concise. I am very curious about whether they can pull this off, and to some degree it's going to depend on Ecuadorian courts. Ecuadorian courts. What's the law? It's a special protocol that's enacted, going to hold true, or is the new president, Moreno, going to be held to account for essentially changing the rule set? We will find out, but good on WikiLeaks for pushing for their, I guess you can say rights, but it's hard to know. It's just the international, essentially living up to asylum. Your country granted Julian Assange asylum, whether you like it or not. Your country granted him asylum. Live up to their obligations. That's the point of the court case, and that's what they're challenging. Part of his asylum is not necessarily shutting him up, or his asylum is not contingent upon you shutting him up. Stay tuned. We'll see what happens. Thanks all.